Welcome to the Renaissance and welcome to Fulani, the Enemy Within, a reply, part 1. And our very important notice to you, our dear viewer, that it is never our intention to offend anyone with our videos. It is not also our intention to suggest, insinuate, or preach hate towards any group, race, tribe, or person. There is also no propaganda or any deliberate attempt to misinform anyone with our videos. The goal of this video is for you to look for the books, journals, magazines, or other publications referenced and study them yourself. Remember, God had so constituted this race, which in the times of the scriptures were called Ethiopians, and which we call Negroes from their color, that they might become the inhabitants of the equatorial or warm regions of the earth. Peter Drummond, 1862. And from Malcolm X, if you form the habit of taking what someone else says about a thing without checking it out for yourself, you will find that other people will have you hating your friends and loving your enemies. And this African proverb, when there is no enemy within, the enemy is outside, cannot hurt you. And here is an erratum from our last video. On the video Structured Slavery for Negroes, a reply, part 1, at the 49:26 mark, narrator said in error, mulattoes resulting from when a Negro man sleeps with a Negro woman and they produce a child, instead of when an Indian man or Native American man slept with a Negro woman and they produced a child. Remember, the Native Americans enslaved Negroes as well, the same way Europeans and Arabs did. So, do you remember our video series about 2 years ago on Fulanese as the enemies within, and how records showed that not only were they not Negroes, but that they were also behind the slave raids or razzias on Negroes, and that the armies in the region came from the Islamic and Fulani slave hunting groups, just renamed, remodeled, and given uniforms, and how the slave hunters of old act as enemies within today. They are still doing the same thing till today. If you doubt us, all you need to do is research what the slave master reports as farmers and herders clash, and you will see the number of people being killed by them. And remember also how some people attacked us over the video. Did you also know that many of them have deleted their comments after they saw what was happening? And then how some accused us of hate towards the Fulbe group, and then retracted their statements after they saw that whatever things we were saying were not us saying it, but the records showing them. And how they also claimed that Fulanese were also sold as their alibi that we were wrong or that we are wrong. However, we got this comment that said they were one of the largest groups to be sold into slavery as far as numbers, Mandigo, Fulani, and Igbo. So you see how they claim victim, even though they were the perpetrators of it. They claim to be victims as well. So he went on to write that I believe we are the three largest tribes. There are some famous Fulanis who were enslaved in North America. For example, Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori was a prince from West Africa who was made a slave in the United States. After spending 40 years in slavery, he was freed in 1828 by order of President John Quincy Adams and Secretary of State Henry Clay. After the Sultan of Morocco requested his release, he was captured near the Futa Jalon. Now remember to ask yourself why, of all the numerous people and others under bondage and slavery at that time, why was he selected for freedom? And remember, when they freed them, they returned them back to their places because they were not supposed to be captured in the first place. That was part of their agreement with the slave masters. And in addition to that, and on a different video, we also got another comment that says, do you accept what is being said about Negroes putting people in bondage, or is that a lie? And also, if black is not the same as Negro, Why does it have that implication in context? We can clearly see that blacks, Ethiopians, and Negroes are all referring to the same people. Now remember, the enemies within will always try to make everyone culpable and everyone guilty. It was through them that the slave master sold the idea of how Negroes could have sold themselves. Those lies persist and exist today because of the enemies within. So we want to look at these two comments and we want you to follow us through to look at what the records are saying so that you understand what the scenario is. Remember, they are still doing what they have been doing since then till today. And with the slave masters' propaganda media telling and misinforming the world that it's a clash. So you will see a situation where 80 to 100 people will be murdered, but the slave master will say herders and farmers clashed, so as to misinform people so that they don't know what is going on. You need to bear this in mind. And in response to the last question that talked about how Negroes could have enslaved themselves, remember, one simple question to debunk that idea is the fact that the Arabs enslaved the Negroes because they used them in harems. It was for sexual exploitation and military. That's what they were using the Negroes for. The Europeans did the same but used the Negroes in the plantations. Now, when they tell you that the Negroes were enslaving themselves, how could they have when they did not have reason to? Now remember, if they told you that a man that was living in a tiny hut of less than the size of a room had 400 slaves, you should be sensible enough to ask, where was he keeping the slaves? Where were they living? Does he have 400 huts to keep the slaves in? And if he had, how did he feed them? How did they live? How could he have had them? And what were they doing for him? You remember, the Negroes never had anything like wholesale farming. So there was nothing they could have done akin to the plantation in the United States and the Caribbean, or the military or the harem of the Arabs. So again, that will debunk that idea. So let us quickly reference the history of slavery and the slave trade, ancient and modern, the African slave trade, and the political history of slavery in the United States, compiled from authentic materials by W. O. Blake, and this was published in 1860. And there we saw something that will very easily debunk that idea that the Negroes had themselves as slaves as well. And it says, when the Negroes see that their resistance is no longer of any avail, they frequently prefer death to slavery. And if they are not prevented, you may see the father rip up first the stomach of his wife, then of his children, and then his own, that they may not fall alive into the hands of the enemy. So our question to our dear friend or whoever claimed that the Negroes were actually enslaving themselves is, how will a slave kill himself in order not to become slaves? So you see that that collapses right there. Because if they were slaves already, there is no way they would have been killing themselves to avoid becoming slaves when they were already slaves. The slave master concocted that idea to justify his atrocities on the Negroes. That's where you saw that. Remember, originally, the allegation against the Negroes were human sacrifices. Then later they graduated to saying, oh, they were already slaves where they were, and we captured them. And that was when the Arabs, the Moors, the Fulanis, the Berbers, the Tuaregs came into what was Negro land and Guinea and were enslaving the people. So you will see where they said things like the slaves were more than the slave masters, so to say. So that was when these people came in. It's just like if you looked at Nigeria today, for example, the so-called Negroes would be more in number than the Fulanis, but the Fulanis enslaved them. That's exactly the same scenario. If you want to understand it, if you don't understand it, put it in the comment section and we can break it down further based on documentary records. Let us also reference a new account of some parts of Guinea and the slave trade, containing the history of the late conquest of the kingdom of Wida by the king of Dahomey. Then, the manner how the Negroes become slaves, the numbers of them yearly exported from Guinea to America, the lawfulness of that trade, the mutinies among them on board the ships where the author has been, etc. And this was written by Captain William Snellgrave, and it was published in 1734. And there we are shown that the slave trade was introduced to the Negroes, and not that the Negroes had it before the slave masters came. And we see where it says, Smith, the African Company's own agent in 1722, tells us the discerning natives accounted their greatest unhappiness that they were ever visited by the Europeans. They say that we Christians introduced the traffic of slaves, and that before our coming they lived in peace. But say they, it is observable that wherever Christianity comes, there come with it a sword, a gun, powder, and ball. So now we ask the person that claims that the Negroes were actually enslaving themselves to explain to us how they could have been enslaving themselves and still be accusing the Europeans of being behind the slave trade. So this was as at 1734. So let us also reference where he got the idea that the Negroes were enslaving themselves. Remember, the enemies within will always buy into whatever the slave master is saying because they work together. It was through them that the slaves were captured. So they have to also protect the agreement or whatever lies the slave master propagates against the Negroes. That's one thing you have to bear in mind. That's why the idea of teaching children in school that the slaves were sold by their own people was there in the same curriculum. And if you notice, there are groups there back in sub-Saharan Africa that their duty is to tell you that it was done by the victims themselves. Now you can hear something that they sold themselves. So you see the same way. If you notice in things like Biafra and Ambazoni agitation, you can research it. You will see that the army, which was the slave hunting militia, quickly on both Cameroon and Nigeria declared any agitation terrorism because they know that they are enslaving the people and they think nobody knows, with the slave master hiding behind them because he provides them with the weapons, knowing that they lack both humanity and common sense. So here is the book, and it's called The Negro Races, a Sociological Study, Volume 1, and you have the Negritos, the Negritians. Negritia is a synonym for Nigeria, which you are welcome to conduct additional research on, and then the Philathers. And this was written by Jerome Dowd, and it was published 1907. And we see where it said, thus, such fertile countries as the West Indies and portions of America, being without a native population, the Negro was originally imported as a slave to fulfill the conditions of a laborer. In his own country, he was a wild savage, and enslaved his brother man. He thus became a victim of his own system to the institution of slavery that is indigenous to the soil of Africa, and that has not been taught to the African by the white man as is currently reported. You see, so he is trying to debunk the fact that everybody is saying it was brought by the white man. But you notice how he wrote it, and like we told you, they are foot soldiers, they lack humanity and common sense. They will accept anything that you say against the Negroes. Bear that in mind. They will also claim to be victims as well. But what you will notice about them is that they will accept anything evil you say about the Negroes. So he went further to say, but that has ever been the peculiar characteristic of African tribes. In his state of slavery, the Negro was compelled to work, and through his labor, every country prospered where he had been introduced. Remember, one of the questions we want to ask you is, how come all the places the Negro was introduced prospered except where he lived? Remember the foot soldiers, like we told you, believe it or not, there is no better way to say it. Like the slave master rightly said, they lack both humanity and common sense. So that's why you see that wherever the Negroes are, the whole place is in squalor, as against where he was introduced, be it the United States, be it Europe, be it even the Middle East. Wherever the Negro labored as a slave, he brought his blessings down there, which is why the slave master works to oppress the Negro. But that's by the way. Our question to you is, have you then wondered why his own place never develops, but he develops every other place off the back of slave labor? But then, back to what we're saying. So this user concluded that the Negroes were actually enslaving themselves. Remember, One of the arguments he has been all over this channel talking about is that the Negroes were enslaving themselves. But he has never been able, like the Aboriginal wannabes, to provide any proof or any sense in that. Because when they tell you that somebody who was supposedly living in a hut enslaved others, they should be able to tell you how a man living in a hut could have 400 slaves, 200 slaves. What do they do? What do they eat? So you see that it doesn't make sense. It's the ambiguity that they leverage on. But then this is where he got the idea and claimed that the Negroes were already enslaving themselves. Meanwhile, you need to also remember that the Negro never went to capture anybody's children or parents or mother them in order to enslave them. So whatever he was doing could have been his own system, but that's by the way. Our interest is to show you what the enemies within show and do. They are the ones that will come and say, yes, that's what we were doing. If the slave master wakes up today to say, we want to compensate these people, we have oppressed them enough, you will hear them say, no, you don't need to, we did it ourselves. That's their normal way. That's the path and they follow. So the book we referenced previously was published in 1734, and from 1734 to 1907, when this other book alleging that the Negroes were actually enslaving themselves before the Europeans came, it will be 173 years apart. So our question to you is, which one do you think holds something close to the truth? The Negroes at that time in 1734 said they regret having the Europeans because they brought the slave trade. And in 1907, an European writing now claimed that the Negroes were enslaving themselves. If you notice, the again follows the same pattern. If you checked today when they wanted to sell their gay propaganda, remember this is not about gay bashing, but you have to follow the facts. They claimed that they existed in Africa before then, and it was the Christians that sent them away, which we already know is a lie if you looked at historical records. So they normally follow the same pattern. They will accuse you of whatever they are doing to you. If you check in places like Nigeria, for example, you notice that when the slave master comes in through his foot soldiers, he will accuse anybody he suspects will be against his treachery by saying what the person will do or preempting the person. If you doubt what we're saying, take a little look at the Nigerian Biafra War of 1967 to 70, when the Nigerian army, well sponsored by the Europeans and Arabs, invaded places like rivers and all that. They told them that they came to liberate them from Biafra that came to kill them. Now remember, these are people that were living peacefully together. But you see, the slave master strikes with terror and then accuses your brother of being behind the terror. That's his game. It doesn't change. If you check it today, you will see he's doing the same thing. If you doubt what we're saying, look at the Biafra agitation, look at Ambazonia agitation, then look at the middle belt of Nigeria, where the massacres are going on, and the slave master is reporting it as a clash between herders and farmers. Can you tell us where the herders and farmers clashed? Who owns the land, and how did they result in the clash? What did the government do? What did the army do? You see that the army looks the other way because the army was a slave hunting militia. It doesn't matter how many uniforms or how much money they pay those that work there. They are just the slave hunters they have always been. But that's a different thing. And we believe that should have answered the question of that the Negroes could have enslaved themselves. Remember, their foot soldiers just listen to whatever the slave master says and they act on it. You see how they just said they were enslaving themselves, despite putting that, contrary to reports that it was done by Europeans, it was by the Negroes. He has bought into it. But then they also forget that the non-Negroes, which is what we are going to look at, were the ones enslaving the Negroes. The Moors, the Arabs, the Fulanis, the Berbers, the Tuaregs invaded what was Negro land and then usurped the authorities in the area. Remember, the Negroes were theocratic. They were ruled through the priests. They never had a standing army, which we shall show and prove to you on this channel one of these days. So these ones came with their physical armies and then took over the whole place and made slaves of the people. Now, when you come in and see them, you will say, oh, they are slaves to themselves. Just the same way you will look at this massacre in the middle belt of what is Nigeria. Now, the slave master is going to say, oh no, that's how they are, black people killing themselves. But blacks are not the same as Negroes. They all know it. But then they use that semantics and technicality to say it is the same people killing themselves. You can't tell us that somebody that is a human, sensible enough, will massacre 50 to 100 people. No compensation will be paid by the government because they control the government too. So a child that lost both parents will not have anybody to take care of them. Now the world will see everyone that lives there as wicked or heartless people, inhuman, whereas it was being done by non-Negroes. That's our interest. And we see from this other comment that according to this person that calls himself Save the State Liberia, that the Fulanese were one of the largest groups to be sold into slavery as far as numbers. Then Mandingos, Fulani, and Igbo. That's according to him. So if you notice, he has removed all the other groups and narrowed it to only 3. Our question to you now is, who could have sold the Fulanese? Who do you think could have sold them? Was it the Europeans? Was it the Arabs? Because they were classified as Arabs at that time. Who could have sold them? Now, that's one question none of them has been able to answer, because they understand that the Negro believes what he is told. That's why you hear them saying they were also sold. Sold by who? They can't tell you. So let us reference the missionary history of Sierra Leone by the Reverend Henry Siddall, and this was published in 1874. And there we are shown that the Fuller arrests attention by his strong Arab and occasionally Roman features. So this should show you that they look like either Arabs or Europeans. So Fuller here means Fulani. They have different appellations. And he goes further to say, the long ringlets that hang down to his shoulders, his thoughtful eye, his measured step, and his rosary of beads generally carried in his hand. You cannot mistake him. He is a disciple of the prophet of Mecca. He is the gold merchant of the coast. And he is more than suspected of being a slave merchant too, because that's what they were doing. It is important to bear in mind that the proper Fullers are not of the Negro race, nor are they the original inhabitants of the countries in which they live. Their features are European. So you see how they came into Negro land, enslaved the people. Now the slave master working with them tells the whole world that no, the people we are capturing were already slaves. So imagine where the Arabs or the Fulanis or the Moors or the Tuaregs or the Berbers captured a bunch of slaves and then sells them to the Europeans or other Arabs. Then the buyers turn around to tell everyone that cared to listen at that time or that condemned them for whatever they were doing that they were already slaves. That's how they got them. Remember, they tried to claim that they were not the ones capturing the Negroes, but that it was done by their brothers. So if you looked at the massacres going on in Nigeria, for example, in Cameroon and in Amazonia and Biafra, you're going to see something similar. So when it happens, you say, oh, it's Nigerians killing themselves, it's Africans killing themselves, without knowing that these people are different from the others. So if we ask you today, this is a mass burial of those massacred by the Fulanese. Now, our question to you is, are you going to say, oh, these are the same black people killing themselves? Or you're going to say they are the same Nigerians or the same Africans? The answer would be no. That's exactly the same scenario. The slave master knows this. That's why he lies about it in his media. Remember,
have you found your dream job as a developer? Or are you stuck in an unfulfilling job? On wearedevelopers.com, you find over 1,000 jobs in Europe.
The BBC is like an espionage tool. So be it BBC Yoruba or BBC Igbo or BBC Hausa, it does espionage. If you notice, they have used the same BBC Hausa to destroy Hausas. So they have now created Igbo and Yoruba. That shows you that's the next level. So our interest is to ask you, why do you think they have BBC Igbo and Yoruba broadcasting freely, but they won't allow you have Radio Biafra, or even in Cameroon have Amazonia? That's because they understand that they are misinforming the people. They use that media going as if they are looking for news, and then they can get into every nook and cranny of your environment, report everything they see back to their Fulani foot soldiers. So that's why when you see the BBC, don't think it's news. It is pure espionage. And going further, it says their hair is straight and silky, and their skin of a tawny hue, inclining to copper. So you see the same copper color you hear the Aboriginal wannabes. They keep repeating, but they carefully avoid the hair because they know that the Indians or the Native Americans have straight hair, but the Negroes have woolly hair. You notice how their propaganda works. They will avoid that part, but you see it being recorded here. Now ask yourself, if in a place like Nigeria, you hear the so-called African Americans tell you are all Nigerians, you are all Africans and all that, even though there are Arabs in Africa, there are Hottentots, Berbers, Tuaregs, whatever, but they chose to carve out a group and call them Africans by the continent, showing that they have no place. That's actually what that indicates. So now you see that they are mentioning the hair here as different, but those ones don't want you to mention that to show you that they know what they are doing. They are lying. But going further, it says these proper Fulans are, however, less numerous than the black Fulans who have sprung from the intermarriages of this tawny race with the Negroes. This is the reason why Fulans are sometimes mentioned in books on Africa as black men and at other times as red men. So when they claim that they were also sold, but they are not Negroes, that should right there tell you that they are lying. But our interest is for you to see how the distribution came. Now, if you're wondering anything about the dark Fulans, that's when the slave master sleeps with the Negro woman and they produce the child. If you notice today, the Fulanis will not allow, let's say, a Negro or let's say an Igbo to marry their daughters, but they can marry us. So when they produce the child will be dark, may not be as fair as the original Fulans, will not have hair as woolly as the original Negroes or as straight as the original Fulanis. So that dark one, they will consider Fulani. That's how these things came. You need to read these materials yourself. Now remember, this was written in 1874. We didn't write it. So that when you say this or that, you look at the records first. All we are showing you is what the records are saying because some people are too lazy to read themselves. So going further, we see where it talks about liberated slaves, and it says the great mass of the population of Freetown. Remember, that's why it was called Freetown. So when you see the Aborigine wannabes telling you that the slave trade never happened, you just need to understand that it is the slave master hiding behind them and giving them lies to propagate, knowing that he can't say it himself. Because if he said it, he will look so foolish and stupid, but he will prefer a Negro saying it out of ignorance and looking foolish and stupid. That's just it. Even if he succeeds in selling that dummy, it doesn't take away the fact that today, anyone that knows his onions and that has read or researched it knows that there is no way the so-called Negroes could have been the same with the so-called Native Americans, and nobody in history observed that until recently somebody born after the 70s picks it up and starts talking garbage. So here it tells us about the Freetown and the people that live there and the inhabitants of the rest of the peninsula who do not come under any of the foregoing 5 designations are either liberated slaves or the descendants of liberated slaves. They have been rescued by the bravery of British sailors from the pestilential atmosphere of the slave ship and have been landed as free men and women on British territory. It was for the distinct purpose of providing a refuge for these unhappy slaves when England commenced her war upon the slave trade that the colony was selected by the British government for their abode as free subjects of the British Crown. It is still maintained for that object and must be maintained so long as the cupidity of the man tempts him to obtain wealth by the abominable traffic which has rendered desolate so many beautiful regions in Africa. So you see how it was. There is no way it could have been peaceful. So when they tell you they sold, it's all a lie. Now you might say, oh, the British were the ones that stopped it. They were also behind it. They are still behind it till tomorrow morning. If you notice, we'll give you a little example. When you hear them talk about Biafra in anywhere, the British, you will notice that they will always say it is Igbo. But then they forget that Igbo at that time referred to all the slaves from the Bight of Benin and Biafra, which you are welcome to research. All these other little groups were created by them after the slave trade. So you see how fraudulent they can be. So they claim to have stopped it, but they are still behind it. They provide the weapons, the logistics, the propaganda. For example, ask yourself how they conjured or came up with farmers and herders clash, where hundreds are dying, children are being made fatherless and parentless, farmlands are being destroyed, homes are being destroyed, people are in IDPs, but they keep misinforming everyone. The same thing they did during the Biafran War. It's just unfortunate, yes, that some Negroes do not have that idea of racial affinity. So they rejoice when others are suffering. But otherwise, the slave master couldn't have had his way the way he's having it. But that's by the way. And going forward here, it says it would not be easy to describe the liberated Africans of Sierra Leone. There are to be found amongst them the discordant elements of many savage tribes, the Ako, the Igbo, the Bassa, the Popo, the Congo, the Calabar, the Koromantin, the Boni, and many others. Now, can this person that is telling us that the Fulanis were mostly sold show us why the Fulani did not appear here? Why didn't they write that they were also sold? When they were the slave hunters, how could they have been sold? This is like telling us that the Nigerian army that is murdering Biafrans is also being killed. When they are the ones killing people, they have all the guns, going after innocent men, women, and children. If you notice, they don't go after Fulani herdsmen killing people. They don't go after Boko Haram. Even though they claim to be going after Boko Haram, that's where they stage for the Negroes to have themselves killed. So ideally, you see all the people that were being sold here from the freed slaves. Remember, when they were freed from Europe, they were shipped back to Freetown. That's how that place was called, Freetown. It was something similar to what they did in Liberia. So you need to understand it. Now, we ask you that claims that the Fulanis were mostly sold. First, tell us by who. Secondly, tell us why they did not appear in any list that they were sold, because we are still going to show you that they were the slave hunters. Also, you will notice that because at that time, these people or the slave master hadn't coined a real appellation for these groups, and even if they had, it hadn't been propagated across everyone. So you see that this author wrote Calabar as Calabar. There was nothing like Efik, nothing like Yoruba per se, because their codes were supposedly in that same area as where you think Yoruba is today, because Yoruba is an integration of the Dahomians, the Fulas, the Igbos, the Akos, the Anagos, name it, in the whole bunch. So the slave master knows how to bring people together and then use his foot soldiers against them. The same way he wanted to establish Ruga, so that he can use his foot soldiers and act as enemies within. His system doesn't follow any different pattern.
Wie sollen wir das machen? Im Knast ein Album aufnehmen.
The same pattern. So you see, going further here, it says, all these, when they are landed in the colony, are complete savages, but the traces of barbarism are deeper in some tribes than in others. The face of their coat is gashed deeply in a perpendicular lines, leaving cicatrices of a lighter color. The Igbos also cut their persons, scoring the face, arms, back, and breast. The face of the Bassa is chopped apparently at random, and the patterns embossed on the backs of the Bassa women are so wonderfully contrived that the skin projects from the wounds as though skins of thread were inserted beneath to raise it. When landed from the slave ship, the captive is generally quite destitute of clothing and has to be taught the necessity of decent covering. The men receive from the colonial authorities a plot of ground, a few implements of husbandry, and a small sum of money each week for a short time until they are able to earn money for their support. So our interest is to ask you, when the Aborigine wannabes claimed that the slave trade story was told them in reverse, you can go and watch Dan Calloway, you see where he said it, that the slaves were stolen from America, shipped to Europe, then from Europe to Africa, and exchanged for African commodities and then shipped back to America. So you can see that this is very ludicrous. But then the same person that told you this has also made another video to tell you that the slave ships did not exist. So your question should now be, when will you start using your brains and stop following lies? He told you that people were shipped, turns around to tell you that the slave ship did not also exist. So did they really trek? So you can at least see it here that they are lying. All they are doing is to make the narrative convoluted, deceive everybody, and then deny the slave trade. That's all they are doing. But the slave master cannot do it himself. He understands the implication of lying brazenly. So he prefers using a Negro or someone that looks like a Negro. So it will be easy to say, oh, they don't have sense already. Or the Hamitic groups, they are foot soldiers like they do. So it's easy to get people who do not have sense already to act as foolish as you consider the narrative. That's all they are doing. They can't say it themselves. But you will see how they are going to leverage on those lies and implement whatever plans they have. It's a very simple trick. They have played it so much. Now, if you watched the move made by the British in leaving the EU, if you knew their records, you will know that they have something planned. They couldn't have just left the EU. Apparently, maybe the EU charter is not allowing them bomb the hell out of Biafra or Ambazonia. Or they are going so that when they do it, there won't be any EU telling them this is wrong. We didn't approve of this. That's all you see them doing. That's why you see them running around, pulling out of the EU and all that. Remember, all these countries, be it the US or Europe, are fed by what was Negroland and Guinea. If you doubt us, we shall prove it. So when you look at the video from Dan Calloway called Harriet Tubman, The History of a Slave Ship, you're going to see at some point at the 1622 mark, he said, "This is why you will not find any historical evidence nor colonial documentation of a transatlantic slave trade during this time period," which is between 1600s and 1800s. Now, this book was published in 1874. So you see that all they are saying are things they want you to believe, not the truth. You need to bear that in mind. So they confuse themselves, confuse you, confuse everybody before they arrive at where they are going. That's all they are trying to do. You will see how they are going to play the trick. Just follow it. Don't believe it because you have no reason to believe it. You know they are lies. But then, because the slave master is hiding behind him, you will see that he will have a lot of views. He will have a lot of favors and all that because the slave master is actually the one sponsoring that. You may also have noticed some of them coming to this channel to say that these books are too old and shouldn't be followed or believed. Now, when they tell you that, remember to ask them, what about the Bible or the Quran that is supposedly older than these books, but they still follow those ones? So you will see that they don't have any argument. All they want is anything that will make you move away or shy away from digging deep to find out what could have transpired back then. Remember to ask yourself, when they say people were sold, those are human beings. Is there a way somebody will come and sell you now? You just sit down there and the person will say, oh, I've sold you, and then you just go. It is done by the army. That's why you see in a place like Nigeria and Cameroon, in Biafra and Ambazonia, they use the army to ensure that they keep that space which belongs to the slave master as one. So if tomorrow they wake up and say, oh no, we agreed to be one, you should know that it is not an agreement, it's a force. They impose it on you. That's why even the Nigerian constitution, somebody wrote it, but he wrote it as we the people. So when they do something outside that constitution, if you talk, they'll say, oh no, the constitution we agreed on. The slave master already has an agreement with them. So they will say, oh no, the constitution said, the constitution said. While you are thinking the constitution said, they could do any atrocity they like, kill as many people as they want. That's who they are. They work in agreement with the slave master. So if you notice, for example, if the constitution was what they were following, why not ask yourself things like the elections, where they put in somebody they want? Why didn't they follow what the constitution said? The constitution is for the slaves. They are above the law. You need to bear that in mind. So you may have noticed that the comment from the Fuller that claims that the Fulanis were largest groups that were sold He mentioned someone who was sold and was redeemed after 40 years. He was redeemed as soon as it was discovered that he was a Fulani, so that you don't think he was just redeemed because they were looking for somebody to redeem. So since he already mentioned it that he was redeemed, let's now look at someone else that was also redeemed, and he was called Job Ben Solomon. So let us reference travels into the inland parts of Africa containing a description of the several nations for the space of 600 miles up the river Gambia, their trade, habits, customs, whatever, the power, disposition, and characters of some Negro princes, with a particular account of Job Ben Solomon, a folly, that is their spelling of Fulani in this case, which you will see shortly, and who was in England in the year 1733 and known by the name of the African, to which is added Captain Srive's voyage up the Gambia in the year 1723 to make discoveries, and this was by Francis Moore and published 1738. Our interest is for you to see here where it says Negro princes. You will see that the Fulanese will claim that they are also Negroes based on this statement. Now we already read to you who they were and what happened in this case. We're going to show you why they will say or make that claim, because that's who they are. But that's a different story. But just for the purpose of this discourse, let's just see what it's all about. So he talks about a Captain Pike, a separate trader from Joa, loaded with slaves, and having stayed a day or two at James Forth, sailed for Maryland, having among his complement of slaves one man called Job Ben Solomon, of the Foley race. So at least you notice that he says it's a Foley race. He didn't say it's Negro race. These are two different people. Our interest is to also ask yourself, how come of all the 400 or 300 people in the slave ship, they are talking about just this one person? But that's by the way for now. And going further, it says, and son to the high priest of Banda in Futa, a place about 10 days journey from Glaciers or whatever, who was traveling on the south side of this river with a servant and about 20 or 30 head of cattle, which induced the king of the country a little way inland between whatever, not only seized his cattle, but also his person and man, and sold them both to Captain Pike, as he was trading at Joa. He would have been redeemed by the Fullers, that's the Fulanese, but was carried out of the river before they had notice of his being a slave. So you see that he was sold without them knowing, and they didn't notice him on time. Now you're going to be wondering, how come? Because he was a bit on the dark side. He was a dark fuller, which we're going to show you shortly. This were well documented, so you don't think there's anything we are telling you that you can't verify. So here we see how he was sold, and the name of the slave ship was Arabella, who was then trading there. By him he was carried to Maryland and sold to a planter, with whom Job lived about a 12-month without being once beat by his master, at the end of which time he had the good fortune to have a letter of his own writing in the Arabic tongue conveyed to England. This letter coming to the hand of Mr. Oglethorpe, he sent the same to Oxford to be translated, which when done gave him so much satisfaction and so good an opinion of the man, that he directly ordered him to be brought from his master. He soon after setting out for Georgia. Before he returned from thence, Job came to England, where being brought to the acquaintance of the learned Sir Hans Sloane or whatever, he was by him found a perfect master of the Arabic tongue, by translating several manuscripts and inscriptions upon medals. He was by him recommended to his grace the Duke of Montague or whatever, who being pleased with the sweetness of humor and mildness of temper, as well as genius and capacity of the man, introduced him to court, where he was graciously received by the royal family and most of the nobility, from whom he received distinguishing marks of favor. After he had continued in England about 14 months, he wanted much to return to his native country, which is Bondo, a place about a week travel overland from the Royal Africa Company's factory at Joa on the River Gambia. of which place his father was high priest, and to whom he sent letters from England. Upon his setting out from England, he received a good many noble presents from her most gracious majesty, Queen Caroline, his highness the Duke of Cumberland, his grace the Duke of Montague, the Earl of Pembroke, several ladies of quality, Mr. Holden, and the Royal African Company, who have ordered their agents to show him the greatest respect. So our question to you is, if he was Negro, why all the millions were still under bondage? He was being freed and being celebrated. So you understand that they sold him in error. Now you notice that whoever made this comment told us that they were the largest being sold. How could they have sold people that were the ones capturing others? How could they have sold them when the Negroes had skills the slave master was looking for and he couldn't find them in other people? And here is an account of when he got home, and he says, on Job's first arrival here, he desired would send a messenger up to his own country to acquaint his friends of his arrival. I spoke to one of the blacks, which we usually employ upon those occasions, to procure me a messenger, who brought to me a fuller, that's a Fulani, who knew the high priest his father, and Job himself, and expressed great joy of seeing him in safety, returned from slavery, he being the only man except one that was ever known to come back to this country after having been once carried a slave out of it by white men. Job gave him the message himself and desired his father should not come down to him, for it was too far for him to travel, and that it was fit for the young to go to the old, and not for the old to come to the young. Now, the person that said so many fullers were sold, the example he gave us, the person was redeemed after 40 years. This one was also redeemed. Can they provide us at least up to 5 or 10 out of the millions that were sold? So that should tell you that they lie. And that's how the lies work. They are within, killing you and telling you you are the same. If you notice, they will tell you, oh, we are all Nigerians, we want one Nigeria, but they are killing you. So if you were the same with them, would they be killing you? The answer would be no. Likewise, during the slave trade, the slave master understands this perfectly. That's why he's always looking for a Fulani to rule. Always. If you notice, that's what he does. Most of those you think are Southerners or that are not Fulanis, some of them have Fulani blood. So if we look again at the book we referenced earlier, and it talks about the manner how the Negroes become slaves, the number of them yearly exported from Guinea to America, the lawfulness of that trade. Remember, they looked for every means to justify it. So at that time, they claimed that the Negroes were sacrificing themselves. So when they were done with that one, they now claim that the Negroes enslaved themselves. Again, we ask you, how can a man who has no farm keep 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, 8 slaves? So if they say they had slaves, this was the apprenticeship system, which you can see if you were to look at some of the establishments in what you will call southern Nigeria today. You will see that the big businesses will have somebody to come and learn the trade under. How do you learn a trade? You respect your master. That's the truth. But they now called it slavery. That's the best you can get. Now, if your family says this is what you want to do, you go and attach yourself to somebody who knows that trade to teach you. How can that be classified as slavery? As against the slave trade they did in the Europeans, the Arabs, and even the Fulanese, where you castrate the man and sleep with the women, cut off their legs if they were to move away or stray away from the farms. How do you balance both? So you see that all these lies can easily be collapsed the moment you bring out a little time of your tight schedule to study. That's all you need to do. Read those old records. Remember, when they tell you the books are too old, you need to now ask yourself, if the books are too old but not older than the Bible, how come they still give you the Bible? So that should tell you right there that it's incumbent upon you to conduct very basic research to understand how their lies work and how they collapse the moment you apply common sense to them. So here is the claims of the slave master of how the slaves were acquired. And the first one, it says, it has been their custom among the Negroes, time out of mind, and is so to this day for them to make slaves of all the captives they take in war. That's if they went to war. Remember, it was the same book that told us that before the Europeans came, there was nothing like the slave trade. So this should now answer that simple question. It's only the captives they make in war. He didn't say they just had slaves. The captives they make in war. We shall look at how they make the wars, or how they could have fought wars with bows and arrows when they had the armies of the Moors, the Arabs, the Fulanis, the Berbers, the Tuaregs that were capturing them. So who will they be making wars with? So that's a different story altogether. Then they said the second one is most crimes amongst them are punished by mullahs or whatever and fines. And if the offender has not wherewithal to pay his fine, he is sold for a slave. Now, at that time, it used to be trade by barter. There were only just about 4 laws, but that's by the way. At least we show you what they are saying. And then the third, they said debtors who refuse to pay their debts or are insolvent are likewise liable to be made slaves, but their friends may redeem them. So at least one good thing about whatever they say about the Negroes is that there is something called redemption. But under the slave masters type of slavery, the Arabs, the Europeans, even the Fulanis, the men were castrated. So if you were castrated and redeemed, how does that change? And remember, they still castrate people in northern Nigeria till tomorrow morning. If you doubt us, investigate. The same Fulanese. And here it tells us about mutiny in the slave ships, and it says the first mutiny I saw among the Negroes happened during my first voyage in the year 1704. It was on board the Eagle Galley of London, commanded by my father, with whom I was as pursuer or whatever. But our interest is for you to see that the ships existed, contrary to what these Aborigine and Indian wannabes are telling you. Remember, they are contracted by the slave master to sell those lies. No sensible person can be telling you that, even after reading the records. But our interest is about this Old Calabar record, and it says we had bought our Negroes in the river of Old Calabar in the Bay of Guinea, which was called Bight of Guinea, and later you'll see within it Bight of Biafra. At the time of their mutiny, we were in that river, having 400 of them on board, and not above 10 white men who were able to do service. That's those that were armed. So you understand what we're talking about. For several of our ship's company were dead, and many more sick. Besides, 2 of our boats were just then gone with 12 people on shore to fetch wood, which lay in sight of the ship. Those are not our interest. Our interest is just the old Calabar you see there. So when they tell you they sold themselves, you need to put it in the right context. It's impossible for a man without arms to have sold another. These are thick woods. All those people you see, like a Jaws, you see in riverine areas, they got there because they were running away from slave hunters. The slave master knows this. All you need to do is read the records, read the old materials. That's all you need. Don't expect that the slave master will teach you those in his class. Remember, he prepares the curriculum and passes it through his foot soldiers, who you already know who they are. They lack humanity, they lack common sense. So you won't see these type of books in the curriculum. He will just present to you what he wants you to believe, and how your forefathers could have sold you, how people will have children and sell them. Now, why not even look at who is killing others today? That should answer your question right there. Let us also reference A History of Colonization of the Western Coast of Africa by Archibald Alexander, and this was published 1846. And there we see first on this map on your left, you see Liberia. But then our interest is where it tells us about who was behind the capture of the slaves at that time. And it tells us very simply here that the Felatas, that's the Fulanese, are so denominated by the Negroes. So when they claim to be Negroes and they were sold too, they need to tell us who sold them. That's all we're interested in. Tell us who sold them. And how come all the ones that were sold that were supposedly Fulanese were redeemed, but no other people were being redeemed? That should be one simple question to ask. And he goes further to say, but the name by which they call themselves is Fulani, which might be more correctly written Fulani, according to the sound of the syllables. The origin of the term felatas is not known, but as they are anthropoclets, like the Tuaregs, and still Negroes to make slaves of them, it is probably an appellation of reproach, like that of Sigo, given to these later. They are known on the Senegal and Gambia as Fulas, and Paul's Mungo Park describes them under the first denomination and M. Mulliam under the second. The Felatas extend from the Atlantic to the confines of Darfur and speak everywhere the same language. That's the same people he is telling you many of them were sold. Remember, they lie. You see the same way the Aborigine wannabes are lying to you today, that the slave trade didn't even happen. These ones are now claiming to be victims as well. But they never mention who made them victims. Who was it that sold them? They will never mention that. Just look at it as the case of Jesus Christ, for example. They keep telling you about his death for you, but they don't tell you about those that murdered him. They only Pilate. They don't mention the Roman soldiers that could have killed him. They just mention you and how he died for you, because they understand that the Negro listens and believes what the master is saying. So if the master wakes up tomorrow to tell the Negro that he was that Lucifer that tempted Eve, the Negro is going to believe it. So that's why you see them coming up with lies that they never thought true. So they just bring anything they like and tell you. They know that you will believe without reading. And that's where Malcolm X told you there, that if you were listening to what people were saying without researching it, without investigating them, you will end up hating your friends and loving your enemies.
Meine Oma hat immer gesagt, das Leben ist genauso wie ein Märchen. Ja, genauso grausam. Und sie hatte recht.
So if you don't understand this, just research whatever you are told, and that will give you an idea of what we're talking about. Let us reference notes on Northern Africa, the Sahara, and Sudan in relation to the ethnography, languages, history, political, and social condition of the nations of those countries by William B. Hodgson, and this was published 1844. And there we see that the races of tawny or tanned color, he says, are called Barbars, Subfusi coloris in color, Apilatis sun barber, or whatever. Thus, he asserts that there are but two races of people in Africa, Negroes and Barbars, which is the division of the Greek historian, Libyans and Ethiopians. So you see, the same way they are trying to change the Negro appellation, the African Americans, to Negro Aborigine now, is the same way you saw how they changed from Ethiopians and Libyans to African. They have super subtle. The slave master is a subtle beast. So you wouldn't understand where he is going. Even the likes of Dane that are propagating it, if you notice, it's an empty claim. It doesn't bestow anything on the Negro. Whether you become Aborigine or you are called anything, those are mere nomenclatures. It doesn't lift you from the servile position. So that's why you see them propagating it. It's just in 1988 that the Jesse Jackson was used by the slave master to change to African American. Now, how you notice what they do is when they approve of it, they just commission one lackey to come and say it and they buy into it. Now, let Jesse Jackson come out and say, okay, we want Biafra and Ambazonia to be free, and see if they will listen to him. At least that will tell you. They tell them what to come and say. So they now hide under that pretext and say, oh, okay, you guys want this, you have it. So ordinarily, when the next generation wakes up from Aborigine, they will change another thing, because there is no way your identity can be a different language from your own if it wasn't the slave master or someone else giving you that name. It doesn't make sense. Because if you check, the Igbos that were returned back to Sierra Leone, for example, Freetown, from slavery, never had the word Igbo before. They said they knew themselves as people of this, people of that, this town and that town, that they didn't know everybody as the same. So you understand how those things come to stick. So do not think they are doing you any favor by giving you a new identity or a new appellation. It doesn't change anything. But you notice in all cases, the subject matter is not the slave hunters, but the victims. So if the victims change their identity, the Portuguese that started the slave trade circa 1434 are still Portuguese till today. But the Negroes have changed from one thing to another up to today and still changing. They are yet to understand who they are. They have crisis of identity, which is most unfortunate. And going further, it says, this I should have said were the two divisions, had I not found among the Negroes this mixed native Mesotamino race, the Fulas. It must be supposed that they existed in Sudan when Leo was there, and I cannot reconcile it with his usual sagacity and discrimination that he did not discover or mention them. The history of the Berbers or Libyans. Note this very well. Remember, when they tell you Africans today, it is the same game. They changed Africa from a tiny portion it was, changed the name Negro land, now made it larger. Within it, they had Ethiopia, they had Libyans. These are the Berbers. If you look at it, you see the names interchangeably. So today, you see, ultimately, you will see how they will start writing African Americans or Aborigines. So ultimately, their name will change. But you won't know. You will think they are doing you any favor. Because if you ask all those Aboriginal wannabes, you will see that all they are interested in is the pride of how their forefathers did not come through a slave ship. That's all they are looking at. Not that it wasn't true. Not that they had any facts. Just that they want to feel good. You know the feel good doctrine, when you see somebody who is suffering, be it a Christian or a Muslim, and you try to remind them that these things you are looking for solutions through were provided to you by the slave masters, and they are telling you how happy or how good God has been all the time, or how Allah has blessed them, or you see a Hebrew Israelite telling you that God put him in slavery because he disobeyed, and you ask them, okay, what did you disobey God in? How could you have been born into slavery and you disobeyed God too? And they can't answer. That's just the same thing. They just want to feel good, because there is no way, if your language was not English, you can be Aborigine. It doesn't make sense unless you're telling us that your language from whenever you said you were living in that land was English. If it wasn't English, what was it? Who is the oldest Negro you know? It won't be anybody more than Phyllis Whitley, that was the first Negro that wrote a book. And if you were to trace her genealogy, you will only get to when she was a slave to the Whitley family. So you see that all those things you're not around to believe do not make sense when you break it down to first principles. And it goes further to say, the history of the Berbers or Libyans is yet to be investigated and written. I yet maintain the opinion advanced some years ago that these people were the heterogeneity, the aboriginal inhabitants of Egypt prior to the historic or monumental era and before the Mizraimites, and their descendants, the Copts, and I anticipate this result from the physical researches of Dr. Morton. This opinion does not conflict with the historic deduction of the learned and ingenious herologist, Mr. George Gliddon, which lectures on the antiquities and literature of Egypt have received the general applause. From this investigation of the Fula language alone, from linguistic evidences, can we hope to trace the origin of this singular people? The following extracts are from Mark Brer, relating to the Fula idiom of speech. Those are not ideally our interest. Our interest is for you to see at least that there are Berbers and there are, of course, the Ethiopians. But today, they tell you you are all Africans. Why not ask yourself, whoever massacres all these people in Africa, whoever is killing his brother or supposedly his brother over Biafra or Ambazonia, just because he was asked to build a road or a school, how can you say such people are brothers? Even if you are dumb, deaf, and stupid. And somebody is telling you that I killed this guy because he's asking for freedom, but he is my brother. Don't you think that is a lie on its own? Do you need a fortune teller to tell you that? But it tells us here again that the Fulas are not Negroes. They differ essentially from the Negro race in all the characteristics which are marked by physical anthropology. They may be said to occupy the intermediate space betwixt the Arab and the Negro. So this tells us about the Moors as well, who also occupy the same midpoint between the Arab and the Negro. So the question becomes, where did the Moors disappear to, and where did the Fulanis appear from? But our interest here is that you see that they are not Negroes. So it doesn't matter what anybody tells you. Now, if this person that is claiming that many of them were sold, but the slave trade was about Negroes, where is he getting such a fact from? Our interest is to show you that they lie. So the reason they tell these lies is, if you're a so-called African American and you hear them say this, you will think, oh, we are all the same. You will know that they were the people that actually sold the slaves. Let us also reference British Nigeria, a geographical and historical description of the British possessions adjacent to the Niger River, West Africa, by Lieutenant Colonel A.F. Mokola Ferryman, and this was published in 1902. And there we are told that in the Mohammedan countries, i.e. the greater part of northern Nigeria, slave raiding is a profession followed by every Mohammedan who can muster a band of armed men. So now you see why they gathered together to tell the Negro that he sold himself, and he believes it. You will see some people claiming that their parents were slave hunters, but then they were in the south. They didn't have a gun. They have never even seen gun before at that time. So you see, it's almost impossible that the Negroes could have sold themselves. Now, if you're looking at the subsistent level of one little girl sold here or there, those are totally different things. And we shall show you how those happened. They were all documented. So don't think that the slave master misinforming us or miseducating us means that those who did not support him at that time will also lie about it. Some of them wrote the truth about the whole thing. At least you see it here. But they tell you, if you're a Muslim or a Christian, they tell you that Islam forbids the slave trade. That's what they tell you, because they know that the Negro listens to what the master is saying, not what he can see. It doesn't matter what the Negro is saying. Just tell him what you want him to believe. That's why you see that they have the temerity to come and tell you that the slave trade didn't happen. You notice that even the Aborigine wannabes already know that that's how you are. That's why he is bold to tell you that slaves were shipped from America. You believe that. He also turned around to tell you that slaves do not exist. The slave ship does not exist or did not exist. You also believe that. He also told you that slave trade was employment. You also believed, because he already has bought you. You are gullible. You can't read. You hold a PhD. But you see a little boy, just because the slave master commissioned him, telling you stories because they sound sweet. You are believing it. And going further, it says, their objects are to capture as many pagans as they can, either retaining them as camp and domestic servants or disposing of them by public sale. A very large number also are required for the payment of tribute by the smaller chiefs to their superiors. And in the Sokoto Empire, where each year the Fula raiders have to travel further south to make their captures, the devastation of pagan villages is almost incredible. The Emir of Adamawa, it is said, until quite recently, sent 10,000 slaves annually to the Sultan of Sokoto. So now what you're telling us is that these 10,000 are all Fulanis. So if they are not Fulanis, who are they? So if they are not Fulanis, who captured them? So who could have captured the Fulani when the Sultan of Sokoto is Fulani? And that's the person they are sending the slaves to as tributes. That system of tributes today is replaced by what they call oil blocks in Nigeria, which you can investigate. So in Nigeria, for example, in the south, in the Bight of Biafra and Benin, your backyard will be an oil block to the Sultan or the army. Remember, the army was a slave hunting militia. So that's how they came into the equation. So our challenge to you is to ask yourself, how come an army officer that did nothing for you, does not feed your children, does not sponsor them, has an oil block in your backyard? But then you are supposedly one people and one Nigeria. Now, if you think it's because, oh, you're one people and the Fulanis are free, no, they give it to some people to make it look like this is what we are doing, but they own it. And it goes further to say the distance is roughly 800 miles, and the hardships endured on a journey of this length must have been so great that probably not one half of those who left Yola reached Warno. This is only one of the score of instances, and to testify to the number of pagans who are continually being captured, we have the evidence of Mr. C.H. Robinson, who had every opportunity during his residence of 3 months in Kano of looking into the state of affairs. He tells us that parties of Mohammedans were constantly arriving with gangs of newly captured slaves, and that on one occasion he saw upwards of 1,000 captives brought in by a single raiding party. We know also what went on in Nupe only 5 years ago, and it is the same in all these Mohammedan states. Slaves, as matters stand, are a necessity, and they must be obtained at all costs. Consequently, there must be perpetual raiding. So now they are telling you it's raiding, telling you troops, but you somehow still believe it's a sell. Tell us what sell, what type of money, what was the exchange. Let's assume, but without conceding, that these northerners come to the south. Tomorrow they are going to tell you that the oil was also you selling the oil to the Europeans. That's why the slave master knows who to give the weapons. Let us reference a narrative of travels in northern Africa in the years 1818, 19, and 20, accompanied by geographical notices of Sudan and of the course of the Niger, with a chart of the routes and a variety of colored plates by Captain G.F. Leon Arwen, and this was published 1821. And there we see the following. Arabs told me that his slaves lay down and drank of it like camels. This man had been, about 6 years before, robbed of all his goods by the Tuaregs of the tribe of Hagar, when on the confines of the kingdom of Kashna on his way from Tunis. But his address or roguery more than supplied his loss. He arrived almost naked at Sakatu, that is Sokoto today, in what you call northern Nigeria. It is where the Boko Haram and Fulani herdsmen you are hearing today are coming from. That's how the slave hunting army was, the Nigerian army. But because it's mixed with people now, different people, that's why it's difficult for them to fully operate with the army. Then you notice that it is the same army that accompanies Fulani herdsmen to come and kill people. So what more do you need to know that this is the same people doing the same thing they were doing? Why do you think the slave master keeps quiet? If you doubt us, remember under Obama, they imposed an arms embargo because a Negro was in power. Ask yourself why they did that. But today, do they talk about that arms embargo? You might think it's Obama. The president is just a smoke screen. It's not the real thing. The powers that be are behind that throne. There are those pulling the strings from behind. Why not ask yourself, how come the presidents all behave alike? Now, if you notice, it's only in sub-Saharan Africa that you saw how another president came in, a Fulani, and all you had was the other one didn't do anything. Everything he did was wrong. But then, if you notice, the one in the US came in and continued business as usual because they have a script they are playing. They understand the game. The ones in sub-Saharan Africa are just the foot soldiers. They lack both humanity and common sense. If you doubt what we're saying, ask yourself why they will write that wherever the Negro was introduced, those places prospered, except where the Negro is from. If you remember and if you notice, when we make videos, we remind you of the fact that the foot soldiers, their duty is to make sure that the place remains in turmoil. The place keeps boiling, to make sure no development comes there, except the ones approved by the slave master, which we shall prove to you, even from their actions. You don't need to believe us. All you need to do is to look at what they are doing. At least if you saw somebody, you ask him to come and build a road or a school that is broken, and he takes a gun and starts killing people over it. You don't need a fortune teller to tell you that there must be something wrong somewhere. So going further a little back from where we were, it says he arrived almost naked at Sakatu, which is Sokoto today in Nigeria, the residence of Bello, son of the celebrated Hatman Danfodio, the Sultan of the Ferrata, that's Sultan of the Fulani. He is called Sultan of Sokoto today, and he is behind all these things you are hearing about Fulani herdsmen. You need to understand that. So anything they're hiding is just because you refuse to read. So he goes further to say, introducing himself as a Sharif or descendant of the Prophet and telling a piteous story of his losses, which he since owns to have been greatly exaggerated. Bello, believing him to be a Sharif, took compassion on him and made him a kingly present of 100 negresses, some of whom then with him were really beautiful. He also supported him for some time. The old man had traded with the negresses and had made a great deal of money, with which he was now returning. Now remember, negresses is just women, female Negroes. At that time, Negroes were not considered human. So just assume he gave him 100 heads of cattle. That's the similitude here. So just how you can see it. Now, this is the Sultan of the Fulani. Are you telling us that he gave the man 100 Fulani women? The answer would be no. So you see who they are. But then somebody is coming to tell you here that they were the largest people sold. Now, if you don't go and read, you will believe what he's saying without knowing that that's the culprit. Those are the people that actually did the selling, telling you lies about how it was done. Let us reference Abeokuta, or sunrise within the tropics, an outline of the origin and progress of the Yoruba mission by Miss Tucker, and this was published 1855. Now remember, the slave master created Yoruba at that time around 1808. It used to be Yareba, so that when you see a difference in the spellings or what they are saying, you understand where it's coming from. But our interest is to show you who these Fulanis are. And here it tells us that when we read of tens and even hundreds of thousands annually falling victim to the slave trade, we naturally ask, how and whence could these multitudes have been procured? And the answer to this question must be sought, for in the very heart of Western Africa, it is true that a small portion of these unhappy people were prisoners taken in continual warfare carried on among the smaller states along the shore, but the chief supply was from the interior, where the love of gain tempted the more powerful chiefs to make war upon their weaker neighbors for the express purpose of procuring slaves for the markets on the coast. Here they were eagerly purchased by Spanish and Portuguese dealers, who in return supplied the native chiefs with rum, gunpowder, firearms, and a few other articles of European manufacture. But here is our interest, so you understand what we're talking about. Now remember, the Aborigine wannabes are telling you didn't happen. So they are telling us that these slaves were captured in Africa and killed on the way. They didn't get to Europe. They didn't get to America. Simply because some people want to be seen as they are Americans. That's all. Not that there's anything that changes in their situation. But then, this is our interest. It says, remember the title is the Felatas, that's the Fulanese. The heathen kings of Dahomey stand out conspicuously in this barbarous warfare, but even they must yield in this disgraceful preeminence to the Mohammedan Felatas. And you see a star by the word Felatas, and it comes down to tell you, called also Fulas and Filanes, so that you see that we didn't write this. You can go read it yourself. At least you can see what they are doing today. All these Biafra and Bazonia issues is them. The slave master knows that all he needs is give them weapons, incite them a little. Because if the slave master wants that to end today, it will end. But unfortunately, he won't. And going further, it says, these singular people who have exercised so extraordinary an influence over the destinies of Western Africa seem to have been originally a nomadic nation in the fertile tracts along the shores of the Mediterranean, but being driven thence by the Saracens or whatever, they retired across the great desert and established themselves to the south and west of it in a tract of country called Fuladu. In this land of refuge, they lived for centuries as a pastoral and inoffensive people, moving about with their flocks and herds as the various spots supplied them with pasturage and water. Their numbers rapidly increased, and spreading eastwards, they gradually occupied the greatest part of Sudan, while small parties even made their way across the Niger into the countries of Busa, Bogo, and the northern part of Yoruba. They are spoken of as whatever, but our interest is for you to see who they were. Now, this person is telling you that many of them were also sold. All we ask him to tell us is by who, so that we understand what is going on. Let him tell us by who. So here you see where it tells us that the present emir is Ali Ben Bello, son of the Sultan Bello, visited by Clapperton, and the direct descendant of the founder of this vast empire, Dan Fodio. And please remember that if you trust the present Sultan too, it's going to be in the same lineage. And remember that seat is exclusive to the Fulanese, so you understand how the game works. And the Sultan is supposedly the leader of all Muslims in that sub-region. Now ask yourself, how come a Negro can be a Muslim when it was the same religion that was used to capture and sell them as slaves? Likewise Christian, when you can actually worship your creator the way you want. But that's because the Negro believes whatever he is told. He is told, oh, this doesn't support slavery, this does, and he believes without researching it. So going further, you see where it says, the great boast of the Felatas has been that their power will soon extend to the sea. That's what they are doing now. So that thing the slave master is telling you is headers and farmers clash. It is their conquest. Now remember, when they succeed, everybody's going to be like Hausas. Your children can't go to school. If you notice how they are, you need to ask yourself, how come they closed all the ports? They are in the desert side, but they closed all the ports in your own side and then left their own side open, or left only one place open which they control to make sure that you don't have food. How can such a people be considered your siblings? Now somebody is telling you they were also sold. Please ask him, sold by who? Now the reason they have to starve people is because they are not brothers with the people. Otherwise, if you were brothers, they would have made things to go round. If you notice the traffic that goes on in Lagos, all it takes is for a sensible person to rule the place and decongest it. So if the ports were all open, all the places the Almighty blessed everybody with, there will be peace, there will be progress. But as far as you have those people with the slave master hiding behind them, there is nothing you can do. That's why we ask you again, especially those who subscribe to the idea of one Nigeria, which is a slave master's game, and those who believe that Nnamdi Kanu committed an offense, please tell us what his crimes are. If you tell us his treason, tell us how. What type of treason can that be? You asked people that you want freedom. They mobilized an army that was supposed to protect all of us if it was a genuine army. But that was the slave hunting militia. It was only renamed Nigerian Army in 1863, which we challenge you to investigate and ask yourself why the same army does not raid and capture Fulani herdsmen killing people, or Boko Haram. And it goes further to say, and from Dr. Bart's account, we find that their boast has so far been accomplished as that the Sultan of Chamba near the Shada about 3 years ago succeeded in a razzia on the country between himself and the Bight of Biafra. Now remember, some of them claim to tell you that no, they didn't raid up to the Bight of Biafra. You hear some of them tell you that Biafra was created in 1967 because they have no idea. The Negroes do not read. Even the bulk of the people there. That's why the slave master hides behind them to propagate lies. Now ask yourself, why will people be lying if they had nothing to hide? Reached the Igbo country near the mouth of the Niger, plundered the whole neighborhood and laid it under a tribute of slaves, salt and cowries. But notwithstanding this and other partial successes, there is reason to hope and believe that the power of the Felatas is on the wane. We learn from Dr. Barth that the whole land is so impoverished that the emir can only maintain the expenses of his government by the large tribute he receives from the caravans that pass through his territories. While Landa, as long ago as 1830, speaks of their losing one town after another in the country of Hausa, and later accounts tell us of the Nufi people having a great degree recovered their independence. So that's why anybody that asks for independence there, the same way Biafra is being subdued today and being fought by the slave masters through the Fulani, was how the Igbas were. The Igbas were independent. Yoruba was created by the slave masters. If you doubt what we're saying, you can even do a test and start calling yourself Oduduwa and see if the international community will accept that. At least they are the ones behind all this. They know that their foot soldiers lack both humanity and common sense. And here you see where it says nearly 70 ports were open to their slave ships, and tens of thousands were annually shipped off to supply the markets of Cuba and Brazil. Oh, could the walls of those dismal factories and barracoons relate the scenes of sorrow and suffering, of cruelty and despair that have taken place within them, we believe we should find that in the annals of the whole world, no page more dark with crime and misery has ever been looked upon by God's all-seeing eye. Africa had indeed become one universal den of desolation, misery, and crime. So you see where they started calling it Africa, because at that time, if you coin a name for a place, you have to start propagating it. So that's why you see some people were still calling Guinea, some people were still calling Ethiopia, some people were still calling Libya. But then when you read different sources, you will understand what they are saying. So he's telling you what Africa is. At that time, Africa they were saying was just where the slaves were coming from, because they had no businesses with the other side where they were not capturing slaves from. Remember, the Arabs had already emptied that area with their slave rates before the Europeans joined, and now started trying to stop them too. So for those that claim that the book is propaganda, we challenge you to go read them yourself. And we ask you, why will those that had this human feeling be propagating lies? These are people that felt pained by that show of shame that Christians and Muslims were capturing human beings and selling as if they were beasts. That's why the slave master now went to claim that the Negroes were not human. You check, even you will see records of British Parliament debating whether or not Negroes have spirits or not, which you know makes no sense, because even if they do, nobody sees spirit. But that's who they are. They know that they can wake up and tell the Negro that you don't have a spirit, and he believes, because they listen to what the master is saying. That's the same reason you see them claiming that Nnamdi Kanu committed treason, and you see an educated man telling you that yes, he committed treason. It's not because they are stupid. It's because they know that the Negroes believe whatever they are told. If they wake up tomorrow to tell you that, oh, Nnamdi Kanu committed any other thing, you will still believe. You saw your EFCC chairman telling you that the virus in China was caused by corruption. That's it. They understand that the Negro listens to whatever the master is saying. Tell him whatever you want him to believe, and he believes you, even if he is a professor. So let's just look at this footnote before we move on to something else. And it says that this is no exaggerated or overcharged picture. We have unhappily abundant evidence, and as late as 1839, Lord John Russell, in his letter to the Lords of the Treasury proposing the Niger expedition, says, I find it impossible to avoid the conclusion that the average number of slaves introduced into America and the West Indies from the western coast of Africa annually exceeds 100,000, and this estimate affords but a very imperfect indication of the real extent of the calamities which this traffic inflicts upon its victims. No record exists of the multitudes who perish in the overland journey to the African coast, or in the passage across the Atlantic, or of the still greater number who fall a sacrifice to the warfare, pillage, and cruelties by which whatever. But our interest is for you to see when the Aborigine wannabes tell you, oh, they are not from Africa. You don't need to listen to us. You don't need to listen to them. You just need to read the materials yourself. All you need to do is look for books that were published, let's say in 1800, 1700, and read them. That's all. So when they tell you research, those are just mere nomenclatures. All it takes is that you look for the accounts and documents that were kept at that time. It will give you a good understanding of what could have transpired. If you listen to how sweet they talk, you will simply be deceived. So don't bother about how sweet their narratives are. Don't bother about the lies they tell you. It will look believable. It is deliberate. They know they are lying. But all you need to do is look for old records, read them yourself. Don't tell us the books are too old because you're reading the Bible or the Quran that are older than them. So don't go there. Let us reference the Journal of Negro History by Carthage Wilson. This was in 1917. And we see where it tells us that the chief, not having a sufficient supply of slaves on hand to trade, caused his big drums to be beaten and organized two bands of troops to execute a raid among the hidden tribes to the east and southwest. The raiding bands attacked only tribes with whom they were at war or who refused to adopt the Mohammedan religion. Now you see again how this claim by the Fulanis that they were also sold collapses. They were already Muslims at that time, so they claim they were the messengers or missionaries of Islam. So if Islam forbids slavery as they lie to us, so who was selling them? How could they have been sold when they were Muslims? So you see again that their lies collapse the moment you apply common sense to it. That's all you need to do. You see here that it says the purchase of felatas or pregnant Negro women or Jews was strictly forbidden by the Sultan. The felatas were not bought because they boasted of being white people. The Negro women could not be bought because the child to be born would be the property of the Sultan if its mother were a heathen, and it would be free if the mother were a Mohammedan. The Jew Negroes could not be bought because they were jewelers, tailors, artisans, and indispensable negotiators. Our interest is for you to see that there is no way the Fulanis could have been sold. You see how he claims that they were the largest people that were sold. Sold by who? They can't tell you. Now you see here it's forbidden to have them sold. Now we challenge you, just as we have shown you where the Fulanis were doing the trading and why the slave master loves them, because the slave master knows where the fools live anyways. So he finds a way to give them the weapons, and from there he steals the resources in the south, destroys the environment, because he understands that there is no way if you owned it, you will allow them to steal it, destroy your environment, kill people if need be, just to grab it. Now, if you don't understand why they are doing it, put it in the comment section. We'll show you where it is documented too. In any case, to better understand why they are doing it, let us quickly reference Africa and its explorers. And you can look at the title on your screen, but our interest is to show you why they are doing it, which is what they are doing till today. If you doubt it, put it in the comment section and we can buttress it further with documentation anyway. And it tells us that schools were plentiful. Most of the people could read. Books of law and theology were not uncommon, and though the mosques were numerous, the natives were not then any more than they are now bigoted Mohammedans. So you see that whatever they have is more hypocritical than anything, and we want you to read this side closely. And it says, most of the towns were well fortified, considering the force likely to be brought against them. The reason was that the Fulans were a warlike people capable of placing 16,000 men in the field and prone to hostilities against their neighbors. Since they could not obtain European goods without slaves, nor slaves without making war. However, only the young and strong were taken. The old and feeble, to avoid trouble, had their throats cut. But they excused themselves for this barbarity by declaring that the people whom they thus raided, robbed and murdered, never prayed to God, and that as the European factories would sell guns, powder and cloth for no other articles except black men and women, the people whom the travelers tried to persuade into more peaceful pursuits had no alternative. Moreover, did not the book, in bracket the Quran, enjoin on the faithful to make war against the infidel? So you see why they are doing it. The slave master understands this. That's why if you notice, your National Assembly in a place like Nigeria would want European cars with public money, but not the ones made in Nigeria. The slave master understands that that determines how they rig in the candidates, so that you don't come there and say buy locally, because the whole essence is to make sure that the Negroes remain down and slaves. That's the reason. So if they buy the European weapons, European goods, that's the interest, or Asian or anything, but not the local one. Those are deliberate. So you see again here that the reason they are doing it is what the slave master tells them he wants for his goods. So if you want his weapons, he wants you to allow him easy access to the oil. So now that they are going to Bitcoins and some of people are pulling out of the EU, you need to follow them closely. Understand where they are going. The slave master is a subtle beast, but he knows where the fools live. He's never smart, but he's heartless, murderous, evil, but he knows where the fools live. And here we come to the end of this edition of Fulani, The Enemy Within, a reply, part 1. We thank you very much for listening, and of course we encourage you to find time to look for the materials referenced and study them yourself. Don't listen to us, don't listen to anybody. Try to make use of your own intellect, especially if you're a Negro or a black person. Just try and use your own intellect and reason out things. Don't listen to it simply because they said. If you look at it very well, you see that the slave master knows how to tell you lies that make no sense and expect you to believe them. That's why we ask you always, when we asked you about the Biafra agitation and they told you that Nnamdi Kanu committed treason, our question to you is, can you explain it? Can you tell us how any sensible person will say because you ask for freedom or you said build house or build school, it becomes treason? That should tell you why they are telling you that. They're not telling you that because they are that dumb and stupid, even though relatively to the slave master who is the beneficiary of their lack of humanity and common sense, they are. But the question is, why do they do that? They understand that the Negro listens to what the master is saying. The slave master understands that. So when you don't listen to him the way he wants you to, he gives them the guns to, knowing that they lack both humanity and common sense. All you need to do is look for these materials referenced, study them yourself, and it will help you understand when they are lying. It doesn't make sense to believe a lie, no matter who is telling it. A lie is still a lie. We thank you very much once again for listening. Peace.